Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So today we're going to start a new series, a new set of episodes focused on one specific topic. And for this first topic, we're talking about sacrifice zones. My plan was to do this series in the summer when I had more time to think through the different analyses and the different studies and all the work that's been done looking at sacrifice zones. But I want to do it now because I'm reading so many different articles and there's so much discussion around sacrifice zones that we need to talk about it now and continue to talk about it. I don't know how long this series will be. I just know that we have to talk about it now. There are too many people being affected. There are too many issues related to sacrifice zones. We need to talk about it and talk about it now. So today, I'm just going to introduce the idea of sacrifice zones. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, familiar with what it represents, but we're going to just introduce the idea, just talk about it, just understand what we mean when we even use the phrase sacrifice zones, because it's a very important concept, particularly in the environmental justice space when you start thinking about certain communities and certain burdens that they have to endure just because of who they are and where they live. And so we're going to talk about that today. I want to ask two questions. One, what are sacrifice zones? And two, how do we get them? How do we end up in a place where we have such a thing as sacrifice zones? That's all we're going to discuss, because before we can even get into the issue, we have to fully understand what we're talking about, and we have to understand why it's important. And so that's what we're doing in this episode. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. So we're talking today about sacrifice zones. And I was going to go into a very specific example because I read an article about this 8-mile stretch between the south side of Chicago and Gary, Indiana, where it is completely lined with industries, with metal plants, with cement plants, recycling facilities, waste facilities, and this article was talking about this area as a sacrifice zone. The idea that the people there have been left and abandoned, and that whole area has just been dumped on continually. And as I was thinking about that article, I said, we need to talk about this because this is very important. But I also said to myself, I don't know if we all understand what a sacrifice zone truly is, how we got to a place where we have sacrifice zones. And I wonder if we even have framework to think about whether or not an area could be considered a sacrifice zone. And so before we even talk about Chicago or any other place that has been deemed a sacrifice zone, I think it's important to get a basic understanding and a conceptual framework around what a sacrifice zone is before we even start talking about what they are, where they are, and how damaging they are. And so before we even talk about any particular location, let's talk about what sacrifice zones are. And let's go back in history. So the term sacrifice zone or sacrifice area came out initially, according to a lot of different researchers and journalists, came out of the Cold War era. And so during the Cold War, we were ramping up nuclear weapons production. We were testing. We were generating lots of nuclear waste from that production, and we had to find a place to test if our weapons worked and a place to dump the waste when we were done with whatever we were producing. And so in a lot of Native American lands, a lot of reservations, a lot of places throughout the country, in the United States at least, where people were not as concerned about the quality of the environment there, we took our weapons production, we took our testing, we took our facilities and left them in those areas. And because of all of the activity surrounding the nuclear work that we were doing, those environments, the soil, the water, the air, it became uninhabitable. People couldn't live there anymore because it was so dangerous and so toxic. And so because the Department of Defense believed so strongly in the mission to develop these weapons, and believed that the waste and the pollution was a byproduct of that production, they determined that there were certain parts of our country where we would dump all this stuff and we would continue to ramp up our production while simultaneously destroying a certain part of our country in the process. And of course, that area was mainly inhabited by Native Americans, by American Indians, and their land was subsequently sacrificed to ramp up our nuclear production and to push back the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so the idea of a sacrifice zone, that you would sacrifice one part of your country or one part of your people for some other mission, became a thing, became part of the discussion. And so if you look back at nuclear production sites, you look back at our military installations, you look back at some of these other locations throughout the country that were mainly indigenous land, reservations, you'll see a legacy of tremendous hazardous pollution and waste and horrific destruction of these natural resources for the purpose of developing our nuclear arsenal. And so that is where many say the beginnings and the understanding of this idea of sacrifice zones came into being. And so that's one stream of thinking as it relates to sacrifice zones. Another one, which I found more literature on and more scientific research behind, was mining operations. And so there are several articles that talked about strip mining, where you would basically destroy your environment, destroy your mountains, destroy your land in order to extract minerals from the land for production. In this case, we were talking about natural resources in the ground. And back in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, and even until today, we've been mining for coal, mining for uranium, mining for different minerals that we believe are important for our society to have. And as a result, we're destroying the environment along the way. I got an excerpt from a research article written in the Scientific American Journal in 1975. And this is how that researcher describes this idea of a sacrifice zone. And many believe that this is when this term really took hold of the national population and became a part of the discussion and became a rallying cry for people who were fed up with the way that extraction was happening in the country. This is what it says from the article, which I have a link to in the description. The researcher says nearly all the Western lands underlain by coal can be classified according to some productive purpose and are capable of serving a range of uses. And then she lists them: grazing, farming, recreation, wildlife, watershed management. The idea is that, okay, there's coal underground, but these lands still have other useful functions. She's only talking about the land, not the people, just the land itself. We can do these things with the land. And then she says this: surface mining without reclamation removes the land forever from productive use. Such land can best be classified as a national sacrifice area. And so what she's contending is, when you start to mine this land without restoring it, you're essentially sacrificing it in such a way that it's no longer useful or productive. It has become a national sacrifice area. You have decided that that area that we got that coal from, that we mined that coal out of, will no longer be useful to us. We're not going to put any more resources or any more energy into salvaging it and restoring it to the original productive uses that it had before we started mining. And so that was the beginning of the discussion about sacrifice areas, sacrifice zones. And she was talking about the land, but there are people that live there who felt the same way about themselves. They said, well, we live here, you're stripping our land, you're not restoring it, you're leaving us here without the ability to use our land to do what we've been doing, to raise our animals, to continue to use the water, continue to have a vibrant ecological environment where we can hunt, where we can camp and do recreational activities, tourism. You're destroying all of that to mine this coal and these minerals because whoever's doing that mining believes that's the more beneficial use for that land, and they're willing to sacrifice everything else in order to get what they believe is most important. And so now people are seeing we're being left here to deal with the fallout from these operations, from these mining activities. And the people who are doing the mining, who are doing the extraction, are not investing, not putting back into place what we relied on to live here. And so they began to call themselves sacrifice. This is a human sacrifice zone, because now the people are being left behind as well as the land itself. And so now we have this new phrase that becomes the call whenever some industry, some corporation, some large entity comes in, takes from the land or dumps onto the land in a way that renders that land useless and renders the people who live there unable to sustain themselves. You either lose your well-being and your economy, or you lose your health and your well-being because of what's happening here. And so now we have this understanding of sacrifice zones. And so now when you look it up online, when you Google it, you'll get lots of different definitions of sacrifice zones. Here's a few of them. Wikipedia says that a sacrifice zone or a sacrifice area is a geographic area that has been permanently impaired by environmental damage or economic disinvestment. They are places damaged through locally unwanted land use, causing chemical pollution, where residents live immediately adjacent to heavily polluted industries or military bases. That's what Wikipedia says. The Climate Reality Project defines sacrifice zones this way. They say sacrifice zones can be best described as places where fence-line communities, where residents, usually low-income families and people of color, live in proximity to polluting industries or military bases that expose them to all kinds of dangerous chemicals and other environmental threats. So they've pulled it back a little bit further and just said, look, if you have these communities living next to these types of facilities, these types of industries, this is a sacrifice zone. The Center for Health, Environment, and Justice define it this way. Sacrifice zones are commonly characterized as communities in proximity to pollution produced by intensive and concentrated industry. Due to redlining, low property values, and other social factors, these communities have historically consisted of low income and or minority populations. And so now we pull it all together. We talk about how these areas are damaged by heavy pollution, by large industry in a concentrated area. So you have a lot of pollution in a small area, and you have that area that is primarily inhabited by low-income families and communities of color. You put all that together, it's easy to see why people would call this a sacrifice zone. Why you'll be able to say these individuals, this land, this area of the country, of the state, of the city has been sacrificed by our officials in order to either produce more of some type of good or service, or to dispose of waste produced through other industrial activities. And so why do we even have these? How do we get to a point where places can be sacrificed, where people, families, children can be not just left behind in terms of being neglected, but actively dumped on by industry after industry over and over in highly concentrated, heavily polluted areas? How's that even happen? Most people would say that when you enter into a city or a county, you have city planners, county planners who decide among themselves, if we want industry to come to our city, where are we going to put it and how are we going to deal with the pollution and the waste that they generate. They look at a map, they evaluate what they believe to be the least desirable areas, the least important parts of their city, and they direct those industries to those locations. And they funnel all the industry, all the factories, all the facilities that pollute, that damage into that area that they've decided is not as desirable as other parts of the city. Now, how is that determined? Some might say the value of the land. Some might say the value of the housing and the office buildings and other commercial places that are located in those areas. However, if you actually study it, look at the data, look at the demographics of those particular parts of the city where these industries are concentrated into, you'll find the same demographics in each and every part of cities that do this. You'll have minority communities at the top of the list, Black communities, Latino communities, indigenous communities, low-income communities, in many cases rural communities, who are literally forgotten, who are so far outside the city that we'll just send those industries out there. Nobody will ever know. Meanwhile, you have people who live there, who love their environment, who live off the land, being impacted by that decision. And so we have corporations doing this. We have city planners, managers, mayors, city council. We have decision makers deciding, instead of placing these industries in certain areas, we're going to take them all and put them all in one place and concentrate them. Let all that pollution, let all that waste be discharged in that one area, and it will become the place where all of that goes. To the point now where they'll be called industrial areas, industrial corridors, industrial regions. And it's just understood that that's what happens. And that area, that part of the city, will be, has been, is continuing to be sacrificed, regardless of the impact that it has. And so that is the biggest problem. And because of these policies that you heard earlier from the Center for Health and Environmental Justice, the idea of redlining, the idea of communities of color being deemed to live in less desirable areas, the idea that because of the policies from previous generations, you've relegated certain individuals, certain families to certain parts of the city, and then the decision makers view those parts of the city as less desirable, and so they make it even less desirable by sending and zoning for their industrial activities to be done in those same areas. And so you have essentially created and perpetuated a sacrifice zone that is hard to come out from under, because the compounding effect of the pollution, of the industrial activity, of the lack of resources from the communities that live and deal with those issues, the lack of investment in those areas because they've been sacrificed, all end up creating a cycle where more and more and more pollution comes and more people get hurt and sick and die, and it becomes more and more of a problem to try to address. And because it's been there so consistently, people making decisions just look at it and say, well, what's one more going to do? What's one more plant going to do? What's one more factory going to do? We already have several there already. And this is not just in the United States. I mean, I live in the United States. I'm thinking about the United States, but all across Africa, all across Asia, parts of Europe where these industries reside and where people have decided that this area is not important enough to take care of, you'll see high levels of pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination. So many issues because of people's willingness to sacrifice certain areas and to sacrifice certain individuals for another purpose, another mission, another goal. That's how we're able to see and continue to see more and more sacrifice zones all across the world. This is what happens. And until people are resisting and pushing back and fighting against these types of decisions and these policies, it'll continue to happen. Because if you go into certain areas, certain parts of any city, you know that there's always going to be a nice, quote unquote, nice part of town and a quote unquote bad part of town. And the quote unquote bad part of town is always characterized seemingly by pollution, by lack of investment. So you have crumbling roads, the buildings are abandoned, the schools. There's so many issues with quote unquote the bad part of town that people look at that and say, well, it's already in this condition. I don't see any problem sending the newest coal-fired power plant to be built in that area. I don't see any issue sending that new manufacturing plant down in that area, that metals processing plant down in that area. And so now you've not only taken a bad situation and made it worse, but you've essentially poisoned the people who live there with this environmental contamination along the way. That's the issue. That's the problem. And so when we think about sacrifice zones, I'm going to leave you with these questions. I want you to think about these questions because these questions will help us to just frame our thinking around these sacrifice zones. Here are my questions. 1. How much is a human life worth? How much is the life worth? Are you able to sacrifice it? Are you able to abandon it? How much is that life worth? Just in general, a human life. Second question. Are all human lives equally valuable? Are they? We have to think about that question because it can't be that some people, some families, some individuals, based on their income, based on their status, based on their ethnicity or race, are more or less valuable than others. We have to remember that we are all equally valuable. And if we think about that and understand it, then when it's time to make these decisions, we think about people, we think about individuals, and we think about families and children, and not just about places and things and production and money and profits and revenue and all these other things that come into consideration when people make decisions. Are all lives equally valuable? I know they are. We have to remind ourselves that each person matters and every life is precious. And if we can continue to remind people of that, and hopefully when we think about the prevalence of sacrifice zones and the willingness to sacrifice a zone, we can have this in our minds. Would we do that to ourselves, to our family? Would we sacrifice them for whatever we're promoting, whatever we believe is important? We should think about that because until we understand that everybody's life is valuable and precious and should be protected, then sacrificing will always be an option. We need to change that thinking in our mind. And this is my last question. I want you to think about this. This is going to be a hard question. Let me ask again. What are we willing to sacrifice to get rid of sacrifice zones? Think about that question. What are you willing to sacrifice to get rid of sacrifice zones? Because what I'm always told is that we have to sacrifice these areas because of what the society demands, what we require. So what are we willing to sacrifice? Are we willing to change the way we produce energy, how we produce and use electricity, gas, all these different things? Are we willing to sacrifice and make changes to reduce our consumption, to reduce what we use? What about how we spend money? Do we need all the fashion, all the materials, all the commodities, all the things that are fueling a lot of the industrial activities that occur, not just in the United States, but around the world? I'm talking about places like China, places like India, places like Ghana and South Africa, Madagascar. All these places have large industries that are fueled by our need for things and for our habits, the way we spend money, the way we spend our time and energy. Are we willing to make those kinds of changes? And are we willing to sacrifice and change the way we eat? You may not know this, but it's what you eat, how you decide what you consume makes a big difference in not just the environment as a whole in terms of the climate, but in terms of the processing plants that seem to always be in these places that are so devastated by environmental burdens and harm and catastrophe. Chicken plants, meat processing plants, hog farms, all of these things are driven and fueled by our eating habits, and they are propped up by a seeming need to serve all of us, all the things that we eat, the things that we consume. I'm not saying that you listening need to sacrifice everything in your whole life. But what I am saying is we need to think very deeply about what we are willing to sacrifice, what we're willing to do to make a difference and to hopefully provide a better future for others as we think about not just sacrifice zones, but everything in terms of environmental justice. And so think about those questions. Ask yourself these questions. When you start reading the articles and you start getting upset about what you're seeing and reading about and what you're learning about, ask yourself, how much is a life worth? Are all lives equally valuable? And am I willing to sacrifice anything at all, to make a change? I think we should all consider that. And so this is the first of many episodes on sacrifice zones. I hope you stay tuned. I hope you continue to listen. And so if you got anything you want to share, any stories, any anecdotes about sacrifice zones, about your experience living in one maybe, or advocating to have one addressed in terms of how it's being managed, anything at all, I would love to hear from you. Reach out. The description has all the links to reach out to us. Let me know, because sacrifice zones are a big deal. They're very prevalent and we can do something about it. Thank you for listening. This is the Environmental Justice Lab podcast, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.